We Republicans, I think, can do something about this, but not if we try to be all things to all people. There are some in our midst who've suggested that we should broaden our base, except that what they mean by broadening our base is to blur the image, to make us indistinguishable from the other party. Some have suggested that the 1974 election, the disastrous results, were an indictment of what we stand for. Well, may I suggest that the meaning of the last election will not be found among those who voted. It will be found by polling those who stayed home, the biggest non-voter bloc in our nation's history. And why did they stay home? Well, because they said they couldn't see any difference between the two parties. I think they're basically wrong, but I think this is also an indication of what our answer should be to those who would make us more like the opponents. I am a convert to Republicanism. I spent most of my adult life as a Democrat, and I can testify that when I found I could no longer follow the leadership of the Democratic Party, I became a Republican not because the parties were the same, but precisely because they were different. More than half of those who didn't vote have been polled and say it no longer makes any difference which party wins. Now some have taken another course. There are some among us, and I respect their views, who suggest that that means an end to the Republican Party, that we should form a new third party. May I suggest an alternative to that? Let's have a new first party, a Republican Party, raising a banner of bold colors, no pale pastels, a banner instantly recognizable as standing for certain values which will not be compromised. Yes, we must broaden our base, but let's broaden it the way we did in 1972. Because those Americans, Democrats and Independents and Republicans, are still out there looking for a banner around which to rally. And we have what they want, what they're seeking. But they don't know that. And sometimes I wonder if we know it.
Painting in bold colors, not soft pastels, with principles that show exactly what we mean. Now, this was a speech by Ronald Reagan where he is discussing the electoral shellacking that the Republican Party had. But I have looked beyond this in my mind here as to exactly what it means for today. And I look at the situation in Ukraine and I say that this message is the same message we should have today. We, the United States, needs to paint in bold colors, a clear contrast to the Russians, a clear contrast to the Chinese, a clear difference between us and North Korea, a clear and complete indication of what makes us special, powerful, capable, a friend that you want on your side, come thick, come thin, come hell or high water. And what we've got now is not a leadership that paints in bold colors. No, our leadership today paints in the faintest pastels they can get away with. To call it even color is giving an insult to a color palette. Because instead of taking the bold actions, the bold directions that show the world that the U.S. is going to be the best in the world today, tomorrow, next week, next month, we are instead taking the back seat. Instead of sending aid to Ukraine in the truck and the boat and literally making a war-winning aid package that would win this war, and tell Vladimir Putin that he cannot take what is not his, that will tell Xi Jinping to sit his butt down and stay in China, not go herring off after Taiwan, not come opposing us anywhere in this world, to leave the Philippines alone, to tell North Korea that South Korea is off limits. Instead, we're dribbling the aid in. Instead, we are showing weakness. And now, after a conversation with some other people, I've come to the conclusion that many of our allies are looking at us, looking at the United States, and saying, is this truly who I want to be allied with? And the nuclear weapons race, the arms race, is taking off once more. All because our allies and our enemies do not believe that we will paint in bold colors with clear red lines that not only if they cross they will hate it, but if they cross it, they will find that they will wish they had never been born. But that is the situation we find ourselves in now. A situation of weak men. And if you'll recall from the saying, it's strong men make good times make weak men make hard times make strong men. And I invite you to consider exactly where in that chain we are. Let's go ahead and get moving on from here. I kind of saw that and I just wanted to talk about it for a little bit. And I had the opportunity to put it together, to grab it and put it into an intro here. So thank you for bearing with me and being allowing me to comment on the situation in the world today and using Ronald Reagan's words to paint that picture. All right, so let's go ahead and get rolling here. Let's see. There we go. And this is, well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily leftovers, but it's kind of a reminder. 10 years ago today, MH17 was shot down by Russian forces stationed in the Donetsk People's Republic. The court found that the Russians were 100% liable for the attack. They found that it was the Russians that were in charge of the Donetsk People's Republic. They found it was the Russians that were running that air defense system that shot down that Dutch airliner and killing all aboard, I might add. So this is the enemy that we find ourselves facing. One that shoots down civilian airliners. One that does not take responsibility for its actions, but instead believes that they can dupe the world in whatever way they wish. From Alex Plitzes, I'm not sure if I got that pronunciation correct, isolationism didn't work a century ago when the world was much less interconnected and interdependent. It won't work now either. The adversary has a say in the timing and whether or not we end up in conflict. Sitting back and leaving them to their devices now means trouble later. And that's kind of the introduction for today. Kind of get into the middle of things, and believe me, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. Let's talk about Belarus for just a moment or two here. According to various sources, the Belarusian military has pulled their military back from the Ukraine border. Now, they had been agitating the situation, um, claiming that the Ukrainians were building up for an assault into Belarus, and so they were putting their soldiers down there. Well, from Informed Napalm, why did Lukashenko suddenly withdraw his troops from the border? The Belarusian opposition media, Belsat, prepared a material with an analysis of the sudden statement of the self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, regarding the withdrawal of Belarusian troops from the border region to permanent deployment points. Journalists believe that Ukraine foiled a large-scale and long-term Belarusian information and psychological operation. This operation began at the end of June when the State Border Committee of the Republic of Belarus accused Ukraine, without evidence, of allegedly concentrating units of the armed forces of Ukraine with heavy equipment on the border. The next day, the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Belarus announced a sudden check of the combat readiness of units on the territory of the Brest and Gomel regions. Special operations forces, missile troops, and artillery were sent to the southern borders. Roadblocks were set up in the border areas. Documents and cars were checked. At the beginning of July, high ranking officials in Belarus periodically accused Ukraine of preparing provocations. The same statements were made in the Kremlin. However, on Saturday, July 13th, Lukashenko unexpectedly arrived at the 56th Anti Aircraft Missile Regiment in Lunita, where he listened to a report on the state of air defense and held a meeting with the heads of all power structures. There, Lukashenko announced the elimination of tensions on the border with Ukraine. According to him, Ukraine withdrew its troops, and now we don't have any complications with the Ukrainians. Therefore, Lukashenko instructed his generals to withdraw troops from the southern borders to places of permanent deployment, so that Ukrainians would understand that we are not going to fight and are not going to concentrate our armed forces here. What caused such a sudden change in behavior? Journalists assume that the trip to Lunetsk was unplanned. Most likely, the decision on détente in the south was made by Lukashenko under the influence of the events of the last few days. On the one hand, the journalist mentioned the publication of the Ukrainian Center of National Resistance, which indicated that the statements of the Belarusian side about the preparation of provocations by Ukraine are nothing more than an information cover for its own provocations on the border. At the time, the Central Security Service said that Belarus could conduct operations under a foreign flag in order to accuse Ukraine of increasing tensions on the border. The Belsat journalist also mentioned the statement of the head of the state administration of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, about the very real threat from the north. Later, it was clarified that the threat in the Sumy and Chernihiv regions was meant, however. Many journalists took this as a statement about the possibility of opening another front along the border with Belarus. And I'm going to try and summarize some of this right at this point in time. This escalation of the situation, of course, is a two-man game. Both sides have to be doing it to escalate. But Lukashenko potentially discovered something interesting. On the other hand, the journalists assume the flights of the Russian Shahed over Belarus could not but cause concern in Lukashenko. Given that Lukashenko recently accused Ukraine of launching drones carrying explosives, given the prolonged escalation of the situation on the border, such an incident could trigger an uncontrolled escalation. That's why Lukashenko probably decided not to play with fire any further and to collapse the information psychological operation, which his generals have been carefully promoting for the last month. The informed Napalm also adds that they're wondering if Lukashenko might be losing control over his generals. But in the end, the flight route of the Shaheeds is programmed by the Russians, and they can adjust that flight plan in the air. But the Russians could then provoke a situation for Lukashenko to have to deal with, and that might have been the final straw that broke the camel's back there. Bear with me as I get the translate to work here. Therefore, it can also be assumed that the Ukrainian forces successfully began to work in advance, exposed the plans, and prevented the escalation of tensions on the border. Now the situation on the border is stable and under control, and the most dissatisfied with this development of events were the Russian so-called warlords. The only question is, are his generals loyal to Lukashenko, or do they take orders from the Kremlin through the head of their boss and work out their participation in the Russian information or psychological operation directly from Moscow? So there's a potential that Lukashenko may be losing control of his own military. And if that's the case, that might explain what's going on the Belarusian border. Al, glad to see you here. And Child L, I'm glad to see you as well. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not, but I hope that it's a good set of memories for you that you like to hear from your buddy from back in '03. Now, I do have more about Belarus going on here. For instance, a Russian Shahid drone actually fell in Belarus and exploded. The drone flew into Belarusian airspace and crashed in the Gomel region, 55 kilometers from the city of Bobrusk, and that's 120 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. Moreover, an explosion occurred during the fall. That is, the Shaheeds that fly into the territory of Belarus are not training or reconnaissance, but real ones with ammunition on board. So that could be a pretty big reason for him to be extra concerned. And Belarus might be trying to attract a little more positive attention from the West, though I have various reasons to believe that, as Admiral Akbar states, it's a trap. Belarus will introduce a visa free entry regime for citizens of 35 European countries starting July 19th. The decision is unilateral. Western countries did not want to cancel visas for Belarusian citizens. The countries covered by the visa free entry innovation are France, Germany, Spain, the Czech Republic, Austria, Great Britain, Hungary, Greece, Denmark, Ireland, Iceland, etc. According to the country's foreign ministry, the measure is intended to demonstrate Belarus's openness and peacefulness and commitment to the principles of good neighborliness. I wonder if something has got Lukashenko running scared. Moving over to the Belgorod region, Russia enforces strict access to Belgorod villages. Only armed and armored men are allowed in those areas. That would be with armored vehicles, weapons, body armor, and helmets in 14 settlements in the Belgorod region. Now, the interesting thing, this is from the Kyiv Post, but I've got multiple confirmations of this happening. It looks like Russia's little uh, sanitary zone, basically their buffer zone, that they were intending to set up in Kharkiv has ended up being set up instead in Belgorod Oblast in the Russian side of things. Putin's spokesman Peskov commented on this and was asked literally, is this the failure of creating that sanitary zone? And he said, no, 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 no. This is all according to plan. This is just temporary. We've been forced to create the sanitary zone, and we are just going to move it to Ukraine. So overall, it's clear that even the Russians are rattled, and they're not sure exactly what to make of it. The governor of Belgorod stated that the situation at the border was due to an extremely difficult operational situation. So, translation: Russia's having trouble. Interesting to see that the Russians are effectively admitting to that particularly challenging set of circumstances. Let's go ahead and move on to the situation, the news out of Ukraine itself. Uh, the Russians and the Ukrainians did another exchange of 95 individuals this time. Many of these men have come home from Russian prison, malnourished, beaten, and with significant injuries. One man actually said that he's having gastrointestinal problems now after being beaten repeatedly by his Russian captors. I also have the equivalent announcement from the Russian side. We'll get there eventually. How's this for the weather in Kharkiv? A man has found a couple of eggs in a nice black pan, and you can see as soon as he cracks them into the pan, the eggs turn white. They are cooking. Now, being from a rather hot climate myself, Las Vegas, Nevada, I fully understand the principles behind this. You can do this. They're claiming temperatures up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is my estimate would be about 122 Fahrenheit. Um, just going off of, yeah, I believe 122 Fahrenheit's about right. So it's getting kind of toasty over in Ukraine at the in the middle of summer here. Ukraine has continued to work on getting rid of corruption in their country. The State Bureau of Investigation of Ukraine has issued a notice of suspicion to former Minister of Internal Affairs Vitaly Zakharchenko in absentia. He is charged with treason and justification of Russian aggression. Now, listen to this here. Immediately after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Zakharchenko called Ukrainian officials with an offer to sign on an agreement with Russia on the so-called friendship and protection, which, according to the agency, meant a voluntary surrender of territories, and in return he offered them, quote, high positions. At the same time, the former head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine emphasized that he was acting on behalf of the Russian leadership. So that's the type of person that tried to jump in the middle of things right at the beginning when it looked like it was very advantageous to be so in the early parts of the war. And understand, there's reasons to believe, especially in that early stage, that Russia could have won with as close as they got to Kiev itself. Now, if you are sick and tired of daylight savings time, well, Ukraine just got rid of it. They have voted for the abolition of the transition of time in Ukraine from winter to summer, meaning that once they switch to winter time, they will no longer be observing daylight savings time at all. Their clocks will no longer change. That's something I wish we'd do here. Now, this statement from the Kyiv Post is very interesting. It says Ukraine has prematurely repaired a 1 gigawatt nuclear power unit and connected it to the grid. The ministry noted that this significantly impacts the stability of the energy system during a challenging period. 1 gigawatt's a lot of juice to hook up to the grid, and the phrasing indicates to me it's likely that they hustled through whatever repairs they had to do to get it back online. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're problematic. All power systems in Ukraine are a challenge right now, but interesting to see they hustled that along. They may have gotten parts from an allied country. I've got something on that a little bit later, but I don't absolutely know that the two are related. So when we get there, I'll mention it. Ukraine reveals the final number of men who updated their mobilization data on their app. From May 18th to July 16th, 4,690,496 military-aged men updated their registration data by the deadline. Now there's still about, I think, another 4 million or so that could also be in the that database, and so there's always going to be challenges associated with it. The bigger problem, says KI Insights, is up to 4 million lawbreakers, a major social and political headache. So 4 million did it voluntarily. 4 million more may actually be out there and able to be called up for service, but they have, at this point in time, not updated their information. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Russia itself. By the way, I'm moving through things pretty quick. If you have questions, feel free to pipe in and let me know and comment. Al says, "Oh yikes, that's hot. When it gets above 80 here in Minnesota, I'm already too hot. I can't imagine 122 degrees." I can imagine it, and I've lived it. The only difference is I'll bet you it's more humid in Ukraine than what I had when I was growing up. So right now I'm suffering well enough in Georgia where the humidity is bumping between 80 and 90%. And they had a nice little run of 97-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. So I was sweating like a stuck pig, but thankfully, I think we've managed to break that heavy humidity section right there. From The Insider, security forces have detained former Moscow government minister Alexander Kabovsky in a case of bribery and fraud. So the interesting thing about Russia's pursuit of fraud and bribes and graft is that it depends on if you're currently in good standing with Vladimir Putin. If you're in good standing with Vladimir Putin, there'll be nobody coming to check your fraud. Now, here's an interesting one right here. Payments to the participants in the invasion of Ukraine reached 1.5% of GDP per year. That's 1.5% of Russia's total gross domestic product. That is doing nothing but being put into salaries and payments to soldiers going to serve in Ukraine in their war over there. That's not sustainable. I looked it up. The U.S. currently spends about 3.5% of its gross domestic product on defense in its entirety. 3.5%. Now we have an enormous GDP. There's some countries, I believe Poland announced that they were going over 4% and possibly up to 5% for in the total cost of their defense. Russia's putting 1.5% of their gross domestic product into just paying salaries. That's not sustainable. 2 warehouses filled with construction materials and the adjacent administrative buildings are on fire in Krasnodar. That was earlier today. There have been a lot of these types of fires going on over there, and that doesn't mean they're all war-related, but just interesting. This Russian soldier published a video of grenades that they received. I initially thought those were apples that were sitting on the ground. No, those are rusty, some of them cracked grenades that they have reportedly received for use in the Kherson direction. Which, by the way, I'm going to pause for a moment here. I don't think I've got it here. Nope, in fact, here it is. Russia's deploying even more ancient T-54 tanks. That's a prototype of this tank that was developed in 1945. So we're talking, what, nearly 100-year-old, well, 80-year-old tanks, at least in design. Obviously, they're going to be newer than that, but still, it's clear that Russia's starting to run out of their Cold War era hardware. They have these vast stockpiles. They've been throwing all of it at Ukraine. They can't build but a handful of their T-90M tanks to put onto the battlefield. So most of the tanks you're seeing now are not only older, but they're refurbished. They're what they could get running and moved out onto a flat and shipped to the front. Does that mean they're running out? Well, no, they had vast stockpiles. Still, go up against a Bradley fighting vehicle with that T-54, you'll quickly find out what those tow missiles are really capable of doing. This is from Wargonzo, which is a Russian source here. The Russian Defense Ministry conducted another exchange of prisoners of war today. 95 of our soldiers returned to Russia and 95 to Ukraine. That's the difference between what we see from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side. From Dmitry at War translated, Russian volunteer Kasharova complains that the unfortunate residents of Belgorod are suffering from the war, but the state is doing nothing for them. She says that even those drivers who are trying to get away from drones are fined for speeding. Could you imagine you're busting your hump down the road trying to get away from a first-person view drone that's chasing you down, and you have a cop give you a ticket for speeding? Taxes have not changed, and destroyed housing is not being restored. Really, that just is the overall situation is that Russia doesn't care about their own populace. If you don't live in Moscow or St. Petersburg or have some vital interest for Vladimir Putin, then you don't get squat. For 2 days now, the south of the so-called Russia and temporarily occupied Crimea have experienced major issues with the energy systems. Many cities were left without electricity. The Russian Channel 13 states that this happened due to a Ukrainian drone strike on a turbo generator at the Rostov nuclear power plant. However, officials say that the emergency occurred due to abnormal heat. So there's a lot of things to pull apart there. The Russians claim that this is a nuclear power plant that has been forced offline or at least into partial operation from an, I'm going to put it this way, an unspecified reason. The Russians do say it was abnormal heat. It was not a drone strike. I don't have anything that leads me to believe that it was a Ukrainian drone strike. The Ukrainians have been pretty good about not targeting nuclear power facilities. That doesn't doesn't mean they won't. Just that would be unusual for them. Medvedev, who is the former president of Russia, stated that the laws of ancient Babylon authorize Russia to start a nuclear war. The laws of ancient Babylon and India, as well as the Old Testament and the Quran, give Russia the right to use nuclear weapons against its adversaries in the West. The principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has a historical character. It was outlined already in the Code of Hammurabi, the laws of Manu, the laws of the 12 tables, and of course in the Old Testament and the Quran. So one can and sometimes must repay evil with evil. Maybe he needs to read more in the New Testament, where it is mentions things like, do good to them who despitefully use you, turn your cheek, to forgive unto 70 times 7. Apparently, he's stuck in an era that is not our modern one, though at the current rate, it looks like it might become. Okay, this is also about the 1.5% of GDP, so I can skip on ahead. I've got some duplicates here. This is the source. It says that the Rostov nuclear power plant had issues with heat or had an accident. So I'm going to move on from there. Again, a lot of times I've got some things that are where I've got multiple sources on things. In Sevastopol, the Russian authorities have introduced power outage schedules of 2 hours on and 2 hours off. All consumers are divided into 2 queues of power outages. The lists are published by Sevastopol Energo. There we go. So again, we're seeing indications that the Russians are having significant issues with their power facilities that they were not expecting to have. Of course, not everybody is feeling charitable on the subject. The mayor of Nevonomysk called on city residents left without electricity to stop whining and to go to Shebekino. Due to the accident at the Rostov nuclear power plant, restrictions were introduced in several districts of the Stavropol territory yesterday evening. Residents of the Stavropol territory complained about problems with electricity, and the mayor said there are no problems. From the Kyiv Post, Russia's vast stocks of Soviet-era weaponry are running out. Now, don't jump for joy just yet. Some are currently estimating an exhaustion of their vast stocks of Soviet-era equipment to still go into 2025. Russia's decommissioned weapons accumulated during the Soviet era, but up to 70% of the old tanks did not move, and others were cleaned and passed off as new. Russian forces are also removing artillery barrels from old equipment and installing them on self-propelled howitzers. If this continues, Russia will reach a critical point of exhaustion by 2025. Now, Kyiv Post is quoting The Economist, but still interesting nonetheless. Now, I don't like to typically do that whole, oh, Russia's running out of things. They're going to run out anytime now because, that's prognosticating into the future. There will never be a point at which Russia is going to say we are entirely out of tanks because they still have some limited manufacturing capability. They can still rebuild to a certain extent existing hardware and equipment, but there will never be a point where they're going to say we're entirely out of tanks. It's just not going to happen. Now, one of the signs that there could be issues with Russia for the mobilization problems, the Russian government is developing a system to prevent potential draftees to the Russian military from leaving the country. On the 11th of July, 2024, the Russian independent media organization Medusa reported that the Russian government is implementing an information exchange system between the Ministry of Defense and the Federal Security Service to pass details of potential conscripts to the FSB Border Guard Service and prevent them from fleeing the country. Reportedly, the system is to be fully functional before the autumn 2024 draft. Russia carries out 2 conscription drafts each year, drafting over 250,000 annually to serve 1 year of compulsory military service. Hundreds of thousands of Russians left the country after the announcement of a partial mobilization in 2022, and these were disproportionately concentrated among the young and highly educated, causing knock-on effects to the labor market. The implementation of this system is likely intended to prevent a smaller scale repeat of this during the annual draft cycle and in the event of a further wave of mobilization, which could mean that there are more waves of mobilization coming in the future. Let's go ahead and move on forward to the international front. By the way, once again, thank you all for joining me. I'm always glad you guys are here because it makes the stream extra special, especially when I get your comments. Now, Boris Johnson had a nice little visit with Donald Trump, and he claims that this is all good stuff for Ukraine. And he states that they discussed Ukraine, that he, quote, has no doubt that he will be strong and decisive in supporting that country and defending democracy. Well, Boris, I'm not going to be holding my breath. That's the problem with Donald Trump is it's always just whatever's on his mind at that moment. So you can't rely on what he says, and you can only half the time rely on what he does. And J.D. Vance has definitely not indicated anything positive from my book, but overall, that's the circumstances. Boris Johnson thinks he knows better than us. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. A laser that burns down drones is a new weapon in South Korea. Now, Ukraine, they've got this nice, slick little video demonstrating the capability. This is from South Korea's Defense Acquisition Program Administration, and of course, the Ukrainians would love to test it. I mean, they've got all the Shahed drones going around, so they would love to test that one. Germany intends to significantly reduce military aid to Ukraine in 2025, according to the latest draft budget. That may change over time. That tends to, at least as far as I've been able to see. 2024, they pledged 8 billion euros, and to have it drop to 4 billion could indicate that the well is running a little bit dry. Hi, Robbie. Glad to have you here. You say good evening. Yes, we shall see what the details are. Hopefully, that the plan have a reasonable outcome. Yeah, I'm hoping a lot of fingers crossed. Al states, I swear Boris's hair never changes. It must be allergic to a comb. And he's always looked like that. That's the thing. Now, if you have been paying attention to the Republican convention, I've had a little bit of time while I've been in my hotel room to just catch a few details. You may have heard of someone by the name of David Sachs. And Mr. Sachs tends to be pretty much as pro-Russian as you can get. It's believed that he had a Russian girlfriend that was probably an FSB agent. There's a bunch of things about Mr. Sachs here. But he got to speak at the Republican National Convention. And he busted out a line calling for basically the end of NATO. And he got crickets, or a total lack of applause. And it's clear if you watch the video that he expected a lot bigger reaction, which may indicate that the baseline faithful Republican still remains a stronger supporter of NATO than certain members of the leadership have been led to believe. On the other hand, unknown drones continue to spy on Ukrainian training grounds in Germany. A German officer said that they assume that some of them have unfriendly intentions, but now they're just incorporating them into their training to caution Ukrainian troops of the real dangers on the battlefield. That's actually stunningly intelligent, if you ask me. If you don't know where the drone's coming from and can't immediately intercept it, you might as well make use of the opportunity to train the Ukrainian soldiers to keep their eyes up there for the problem that they may get from above. Donald Trump, this is coming from the Kyiv Post, did eventually say that he was considering lifting sanctions on Russia. He said, yes, what we are doing with sanctions is pushing everyone away from us. I don't like sanctions. Now, Donald Trump was vague on that answer. Um, Pretty typical for him. But again, just FYI, it's just pointing out that the message is out there. Japan will transfer $3.3 billion to Ukraine from frozen Russian assets. This is part of the loans that G7 members will provide to Ukraine using interest from those Russian assets. So we're still getting, there's things coming in. There's good news. There's bad news too, but we try and get a little bit of everything in here to keep things, keep you updated on what's actually going on. India. Now, you may have noticed the other day that India's president, I believe, or prime minister, I'm not sure which one it is, Modi, went and made a visit. Oh, yeah, prime minister. Made a visit to Moscow, ended up hugging Vladimir Putin. It was at the same time that the Okhmadit Children's Hospital was bombed by Russia. And Zelensky made some negative commentary about him hugging the bloodthirsty dictator. Well, now the Indian government has summoned the diplomat to India from Ukraine, and is demanding an explanation. So we'll be watching that one to see if what comes out of that, if there's a conversation that comes out. India is a bit of a wild card in this whole situation. They've been a customer of Russia's for many, many years, and they've generally been considered an ally of Russia's, but they're opposed to China, and China is now an ally of Russia's. So that whole situation's getting kind of weird. Now, this is the one I mentioned earlier where the Ukrainians reported they'd gotten that gigawatt nuclear power plant operational. This one may be related, but I don't know for sure. A Lithuanian company, Ignitis Gamyba, will give Ukraine equipment from the Vilnius Thermal Power Plant 3 to help restore its energy infrastructure. Now, they did say thermal power plant on this one, so that's probably not related to the nuclear plant. But just FYI, this is more power equipment coming in a hurry that'll help out Ukraine tremendously in rebuilding their infrastructure. Baltic states to complete decoupling from Russian-controlled power grid by early 2025. That's right. The Baltics are entirely cutting themselves off from Russia now. They were part of the Russian grid, but they're transferring over to the European one. Now, this one's got a couple of different perspectives on it. I'll try to summarize it neatly here. Greece is decommissioning 32 of their old F-16 Block 30 fighter jets. They're giving them or selling them to the U.S. I'm not clear on which one because the sources disagree. The U.S. is supposed to refurbish them, update them, modernize them, and then give them to Ukraine, with the attendant, of course, restrictions that might be there. But Knoll reports said this news is written so wrongly everywhere. Greece only intends to sell this F-16s to the U.S., but wants a guarantee that it can purchase F-35s or Rafales as replacements. It does not want to deliver prematurely due to the threat from Turkey, which is what they said about it, and does not want to cause gaps in their air force. If there is a deal, it will take years and deliveries will be piecemeal. So there's several different perspectives on that one, all together, just giving you the report. And finally, on the international front, the Houthis over in Yemen attacked two tankers carrying Russian oil. They attacked the Chaos Lion carrying crude oil from Tuapse, and the tanker Bentley 1 heading to Shanghai from Taman, which also carried Russian oil. So we don't know if that was the Houthis are getting a little less careful about their targeting. We don't know the details on that, other than that the Russian cargo was part of the attack there. Interesting. Never know what the Houthis are going to do. Now, not a lot on the front lines today, so we won't be here for very long. War Gonzo's kind of got the best summary here. Translate there. No change in Zaporizhia. Donetsk, Krasnodarivka, further advances by the Russian troops, with the Ukrainians continuing to resist but getting into a worse situation. Karlivka, heavy fighting continuing on the outskirts of the village and the shore of the Karlovskoy Reservoir. This is basically they're to say this is a head-on assault here. There's nothing creative or any real tactics involved. Just basically throwing men and equipment at the problem and trying to make it go away. Um, the Russians managed to expand their zone of control over Novoselivka and Pervaya and improve their positions in Yevgenovka, which I'm not sure where that one is. Chasov Yar, more fighting, no real changes. Kharkiv front, no significant changes. Now, I have seen some updates on the Kharkiv area. There's kind of some redrawing of the lines, but nothing really big changing at this point in time. Now, this next one is from BBC Russian. Ukrainian army has left Krinky. Now, that is, if you don't remember, that is just south of the Dnieper River in the Kherson Oblast area. The Ukrainians have maintained a force in Krinky for going on 6-8 months now. Going from memory on that one, but it's been a long-running bridgehead south of the Dnieper River. And the Ukrainian military is reporting, or the BBC Russian is reporting, the Ukrainian military is saying that they have pulled out of Krinky itself. Now, they do have other bridgeheads that they are still maintaining, and it's just this one that was evacuated. However, let me see if I can find it here. I've got it here somewhere. However, from the Kyiv Independent, the Ukrainian forces are still fighting in Krinky, according to their contact. Now, overall, the situation in Krinky is that anything that could be used for cover is basically flattened at this point. So there's not much left to fight over. Overall, though, it appears that it's done its main purpose, which is forcing Russia to dedicate men and equipment to taking care of that area right there. Russia has now lost their 100th T-90 tank, according to Oryx. Now, that is the T-90M is their most modern battle tank on the battlefield. And that is, of course, just by visual losses. So they've probably lost more than that. And finally, from Null Reports, this is also on Krinky. I'd forgotten, but this was here. They've basically moved off to different areas instead of fighting in Krinky itself. Now, they're a little bit more pessimistic about it, saying why were valuable Marines there in the first place. But overall, I'm not going to be the one that calls into question that tactical situation there. And that's the front lines. No major changes today. The big surprise was Krinky. But overall, still, things are continuing just like they have been for the last while. Let's go ahead and move on to the interesting extras here. This one caught my eye. Sanitary, a former CIA analyst and member of the White House National Security Council, considered a top expert on North Korea, charged with secretly working for the government of South Korea instead. She was South Korean born. Just interesting to see. I don't know what to make of that one yet. But divided loyalties in our government is not a good thing, even when they're divided for our allies. This group of Russian soldiers complained bitterly about the situation in the special military operation. We voluntarily signed these contracts to participate in the SMO to eradicate this fascism. But in the end, fascism is among us and is trying to eradicate us by any means necessary. The Russian soldiers of the 5th Company of the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment suddenly realized that they were simply being nullified by their commanders, whom they had never even seen in person, and decided to appeal to Putin. Best of luck to them to figure out if Putin's going to do anything but send them back into the fray. Now, this little video is of another Ukrainian warrior cat there, not afraid of anything, even the shelling. Always fascinating to see how unbothered cats can be in these situations of war. Super strange. On the other hand, this cat, which is kind of hard to see on the screen, I think, that man is holding a large gray cat. It is not a stuffed animal. But let me read the story here. It is short. A few moments before a Russian strike on Belgorod, a cat started meowing like crazy and calling his human to go into another room. She listened, and that saved both of their lives. So that's a good cat. Big cat, too. Big, fluffy cat. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me today. As you know, I'm always glad to have you here and appreciate all the comments you make. I want you to know that even in the darkest times, there is light. There is hope. And when the cause is just, then God is on your side. And on that note, you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you on the next video.